Mark Harvey. He's head of professional infrastructure and senior infrastructure advisor at the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office. He has worked on international development in a variety of countries over the last 25 years. And so Mark, the floor is yours. His presentation today is about organizational lesson learned in reducing risks due to natural hazards. So Mark, the floor is yours. Okay, let me. Okay, Mark, I think you are, I can see you on mute.
Is that better?
Yes, fantastic. Now we can hear you.
You can hear me. Can you see me? I know the screen.
Yes, we can see you in the video, and you should be able to see the slides that Joe has put.
Yeah, apologies. I'm not worried about being seen. I just don't want to do anything embarrassing for me or for anybody else. So starting, I've got 4 slides, and the first one is just a title, so it's pretty easy. As some of you will know, being invited to contribute to something like this, you wonder what can you say? I'm not an expert, but I've been in touch with the University of Bristol on a couple of occasions in the past, in particular looking at sort of seismic engineering, and been involved in something in the last couple of years. So the title is relevant, and I was asked to pose some questions at the end leading into the broader discussion. I've really only got one question at the end, which may be too broad to think about, but I think it's the key one. So moving on to the second slide, if Joe could do that. And yes. I think it's worked. Yes, I'm also looking at my own laptop. The reason I'm doing this from my phone is because I can't join Zoom from my work laptop. And you don't need to read particularly what's on that slide, and it's not meant to be my life story. But I'm not an expert in this, and yet in some ways I've witnessed or experienced or been party to or been a distant observer of many things, and there are many more I could have listed. So I thought I would reflect on that. I also need to say that I'm now with FCDO, which is a merger of what was the Foreign and Commonwealth Office and what was DFID, for those who know these things. And we're still going through that organizational change, which means I'm really talking from a very personal perspective here. And with that merger, I would note that, to be honest, in the last 12 months, we've probably been dealing with more human-made disasters than natural disasters. I won't go into it, but there's obviously the Ukraine crisis at the moment, and previous to that, there was the Afghanistan crisis last August, and how the organisation in the country was going to respond to that. The only reason I've listed these particular personal events is there was something very recently, which was the 55th, I think, anniversary of in October of a disaster in South Wales. And the only reason I mention it, it was in the news recently in the UK. I can remember it vividly as a child. My grandmother lived not far from where it took place, and it was the collapse of a tailings dam. The only reason I mention it is because ironically perhaps, I don't know if that's the right word, the first consultancy firm I started working for after university were experts in tailings dam design, and yet it's still relevant, certainly in the UK, that there still needs to be some decommissioning of that sort of infrastructure, which has to be paid for, and there's still an argument in the UK about how that should be paid for. There were other events over the years, I don't need to list them, and some tragically even more recent in Malawi. But I refer to them because I have been involved in a big way or small way in some of those. So on to slide 3, if you would, Joe, thanks. So the reason I mentioned them, so the first one, coincidence, I ended up working for consultants specialising in tailings dam design and construction, which is relevant both to the UK and in, say, in Africa, in Zambia, where I then worked with tailings dams. I did witness the outcome of, or the immediate aftermath of the Maharashtra earthquake in India in 1993, and saw some good and some less good responses. Now, picking up on what Michaela was just talking about on shelter design, there were some innovative, creative suggestions from in that response, which were not very popular with the local people, and so went to waste. They weren't used. Also picking up on something I think Michelle was saying just now about the response was very much about governance. That's what happened in Nepal. A lot of colleagues worked on the immediate response following that earthquake in Nepal, with technical support and strengthening and retrofitting, all that sort of stuff. I hear, and colleagues, I haven't been able to touch base with them recently, but the programs have evolved very much into sort of local governance, touching on standards and construction capability and capacity. I'm struck by visiting Sierra Leone myself. I remember seeing this was before the event happened in Sierra Leone, but we've had colleagues looking at waste management and urban planning in Southern Africa. Need to remind them, hopefully you're seeing where this message is going at the end. Most importantly for this, and this is where I got involved in talking to the University of Bristol colleagues, was around the Pakistan school construction program in the last couple of years, where we had to support the consultants undertaking some seismic modelling with peer review of the design and construction capacity of the buildings and the work that had been put in place. And lastly, I'll just mention the not direct reference to Malawi, but we are now, or have been for a couple of years, supporting the India-led Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure, which you would say is a policy and programming response of the organisation. So I'll just move on to the last slide, and I'm looking at my own last slide. So if it is about organisational lessons, there's one question which is in the red text. The key question for me is going from those previous personal experiences. How do you go from that personal lessons learned to organisational lessons for better policies, programmes, plans, and practice? I'll refer to one book, which heavens, I find it amazing. I came across it in 1993, and it's from the Institution of Chemical Engineers in the UK. And I remember reading it, and I was hooked on it. How organisations don't have a memory, accidents recur, so you do need institutional memories and procedures and practices which continually get improved. So that's stood me sort of in good stead in my role as head of fashion in FCDO. So what we did in the last couple of years, following in particular the involvement of the Pakistan Schools Programme, is we started developing on an internal guide on infrastructure. But FCDO, the organisation I work for, doesn't often, very, very rarely, gets involved in direct construction activities of infrastructure. But we work through others, and we expect others to do that. So we need to be an informed client or donor or facilitator, and we need to remind ourselves about these sorts of issues. We have a technical competency framework that we use for our professional colleagues, the advisors in the group that I heard and bring together. And certainly in the last 3 or 4 years, I've sort of re-strengthened, if you like, some of the harder technical engineering expertise in there, because that had slipped off our agenda a little bit as we began to focus more on financing and policy and reform and transformational issues in the enabling environment. But we still need to have that engineering understanding. We also did make some improvements internally from some internal audit findings to recommend better training and capacity building for senior responsible owners across the organisation, drawing on case studies from recent experiences and strengthening our approaches to risk, the organisation, and I've put in brackets me as the head of profession, we do need to have a better understanding of who we've got in our group, both as individuals and across the CADA, the group of advisors we look after. And we need to have a better system, I think, for identifying some of the technical risks. There's a tendency to focus on the evidence at the business case stage and perhaps not follow it through as strongly as we could do in the program cycle. Of course, it's easy to say all these things after the event, all the events, but it is a continuous cycle of improving. And I just reflect on, say 3 things that support that key question about how to go from sort of personal lessons and experience into organisational ones. I can remember some time ago, there was an expectation in response to actual disasters where DFID would provide resources to enable the response. There was an expectation that 10% of those resources would go into disaster preparedness for the future. And I'm not sure if that policy is still adhered to. I hope it is. I'm not sure if anybody's ever measured it, but it is worth reminding ourselves of that. I'd stress that as one of the heads of profession, it's easy to say these things, but I'm one of 13, and we would claim, and we do, that we champion interdisciplinarity in all that we do. So we work outside our silos with economists and health advisors and livelihoods and climate advisors. So we stress that we do need that interdisciplinary approach. And the last thing I'd say is the key question for this discussion perhaps is the research, not necessarily formal research, but the way we work internally is to capture experiences and not just randomized control trials and formal research, but it's about capturing those lessons. Whether we do that particularly well or not, I think we're not bad, but we can get better. I'm quite happy to answer any questions, but I imagine the conversation that follows will be more lively, but I'll come back to that key question. I've just thrown in to those slides some personal lessons. I can remember specific details from each one of those, which probably touched on some of the earlier presentations. Look forward to joining the discussion. I hope I'm able to do it from my phone. And I'll hand it back to Flavia. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Mark. There were very useful and interesting points that introduce very nicely us to our last bit of the webinar, our panel. So, and I would encourage all the attendees to post their question and participate to the panel and post question for Mark. I would pass on to John, yes, okay, for sharing the panel discussion.